Hey history buffs, welcome back to the channel. Today we're diving into one of the most fascinating what-if scenarios in American history. What would have happened if Joseph Galloway's Plan of Union had actually been accepted by the Continental Congress in 1774? Now, I know what you're thinking, who the heck is Joseph Galloway? Well, buckle up, Buttercup, because this Pennsylvania lawyer almost changed the entire course of American history with a plan that lost by just one vote. But here's the thing, the internet is absolutely crawling with myths and misconceptions about this alternate history scenario. So today, we're going to debunk the 5 biggest myths about what would have happened if Galloway had won. And before we start, let me just say yes, I know some of you are going to get triggered by actual historical facts, but hey, that's what the comment section is for, right? Okay, let's start with the big one. A lot of people seem to think that if Galloway's Plan of Union had been accepted, we would have skipped the whole Revolutionary War thing entirely and just lived happily ever after under British rule. Here's what actually would have happened. Galloway's plan called for the creation of an American colonial parliament, a Grand Council, that would work alongside the British Parliament. This council would have veto power over British decisions affecting the colonies, particularly regarding trade and taxation. Sounds great, right? Problem solved? Wrong? Dead wrong? First off, the plan still required approval from the British Parliament, and here's a fun fact. The British weren't exactly in a let's give the colonists more power mood in 1774. The coercive acts, the ones the colonists called the Intolerable Acts, had just been passed. King George Roman III wasn't about to say, oh, you want your own parliament. Sure thing, chaps, according to Robert Middlecoff's The Glorious Cause. Even if Galloway's plan had passed the Continental Congress, it would have faced massive opposition in London. The British government was already committed to reasserting imperial control, not sharing it. But let's say, hypothetically, that both sides had agreed. Even then, you're looking at a system with built-in conflict. Who decides what issues affect the colonies? What happens when the two parliaments disagree? The plan was basically a recipe for constitutional crisis. The reality is that by 1774, the fundamental disagreement between Britain and the colonies wasn't about representation, it was about whether the colonies were subordinate to Britain at all. Galloway's plan didn't solve that, it just created a fancier way to argue about it. Here's another one that makes me want to bang my head against a wall. I keep seeing people claim that Galloway's plan had widespread support among moderate colonists and only failed because of radical extremists. Like Sam Adams, listen, I get it. It's a nice, clean narrative. Reasonable moderates vs. crazy radicals, but it's about as historically accurate as a Renaissance fair. The truth is that Galloway's plan faced opposition from across the political spectrum, and for good reason. According to the Journal of the Continental Congress, when the plan was debated on September 28 in 1774, it wasn't just the so-called radicals who opposed it. Patrick Henry and Richard Henry Lee, who led the opposition, weren't fringe extremists, they were respected Virginia gentlemen who raised legitimate concerns. They argued that the plan was a ruse to secure England's dominance over colonial affairs, and they weren't wrong. Even more telling, the plan lost by just one vote, but that doesn't mean it was popular. Many delegates who might have supported compromise were uncomfortable with Galloway's specific proposal. John Adams, hardly a fire-breathing radical in 1774, called it a plan for enslaving America. The idea that there was some clear moderate consensus that got hijacked by radicals is pure fantasy. Colonial opinion was way more complex and nuanced than that. Oh boy, this is my personal favorite. The idea that if Galloway had won, the American colonies would have just peacefully evolved into something like Canada, eventually getting independence through polite constitutional means instead of all that messy war business. There's just one tiny problem with this theory. Canada and the American colonies were completely different situations. First, Canada didn't become a unified dominion until 1867, that's almost a century later. And even then, it took decades more to achieve full independence. The British North America Act of 1867 created Canadian Confederation, but Canada didn't get full sovereignty until the Statute of Westminster in 1931. That's 157 years after Galloway's plan failed, people. But here's the bigger issue. The American colonies in 1770 already had over 150 years of relative self-governance. They had their own assemblies, their own legal traditions, and most importantly, their own economic interests that increasingly clashed with British policy. According to Bernard Bailyn's The Ideological Origins of the American Revolution, American colonists had developed a fundamentally different understanding of their relationship with Britain than other colonial territories. They saw themselves as British subjects with the rights of Englishmen, not as subordinate colonials. The Canadian model worked because it was imposed on territories that never had that same level of autonomous development. The American colonies weren't going to voluntarily accept a subordinate status they'd never really acknowledged in the first place. Plus, let's be honest here, even if some version of Galloway's plan had worked, do you really think the British would have just let go of the most profitable colonies in their empire without a fight? The economic value of the American colonies was enormous. Britain wasn't in the habit of giving up lucrative territories just because it was the polite thing to do. Here's where we need to talk about Joseph Galloway himself, because the myth of Galloway as a reasonable moderate trying to find middle ground is, well, let's just say it's complicated. Yes, Galloway initially opposed some British policies. He criticized the Stamp Act and the Townshend Acts, but by 1774 his motivations were pretty clear. He wanted to preserve British rule, not colonial rights. Here's what people conveniently forget. After his plan failed, Galloway didn't say, well, I tried, and joined the Patriot cause. Nope, he became a full-blown loyalist. During the war, he actively collaborated with the British military, served as a civil administrator in occupied Philadelphia, and even helped plan military operations against his former neighbors. According to John Furling's The Loyalist Mind, Galloway's plan wasn't really about compromise, it was about finding a way to maintain British authority while giving the appearance of colonial participation. The plan would have created a colonial parliament, yes, but one that was still subordinate to the Crown and British Parliament. Look at the plan's actual language. The Grand Council would be appointed by colonial assemblies, but presided over by a President General appointed by the Crown. All acts would require approval from both the Colonial Council and the British Parliament. In practice, this meant Britain could veto anything the colonials wanted, but the colonials couldn't act without British consent. That's not moderate compromise, that's clever constitutional engineering designed to preserve British control while making it look like the colonies had a voice. And finally, we get to the big emotional myth, the idea that the failure of Galloway's plan was some kind of historical tragedy that condemned America to years of unnecessary bloodshed. This is where I have to get a little philosophical with you folks. The assumption here is that war is always the worst option, and that any peaceful solution, even one that preserves colonial subordination, would have been better than the Revolutionary War. But here's the thing, the issues that led to the revolution weren't going away. The fundamental question was whether the American colonies were going to be self-governing or not. Galloway's plan didn't answer that question, it just postponed it. According to Gordon Wood's The Radicalism of the American Revolution, the conflict wasn't really about taxation or representation. It was about whether America would develop its own democratic institutions or remain part of a hierarchical imperial system. Even if Galloway's plan had passed and somehow been accepted by Britain, you're still looking at a system where ultimate authority rested with the Crown and British Parliament. Sooner or later, that was going to create conflict. Look at what happened in Ireland. They had their own parliament for centuries, but ultimate authority still rested with Britain. How did that work out? Spoiler alert, it didn't. Ireland still had to fight for independence, just later and under worse circumstances. The American Revolution wasn't just about immediate grievances, it was about creating a new form of government based on popular sovereignty. Galloway's plan would have made that impossible. And let's be brutally honest here, the Revolutionary War, for all its costs, created the foundation for American democracy. Yes, it was bloody. Yes, it was expensive. But it also established the principle that governments derive their power from the consent of the governed. Galloway's plan would have enshrined the opposite principle. So there you have it, folks. 5 myths about the Galloway plan officially sent to the historical graveyard where they belong. Turns out real history doesn't come with neat little what-if scenarios that solve everything shocking, I know. Joseph Galloway's plan of union wasn't a missed opportunity for peaceful compromise, it was a clever attempt to preserve British control while making the colonists think they had a voice. Its failure wasn't a tragedy, it was probably inevitable given the fundamental incompatibility between British imperial goals and American aspirations for self-governance. The Revolutionary War wasn't some unnecessary catastrophe that could have been avoided with better diplomacy. It was the result of genuinely irreconcilable differences about the nature of government and political authority. Sometimes, unfortunately, there really isn't a middle ground. Sometimes you have to choose between competing visions of how society should be organized. The American colonists made their choice, and we're still living with the consequences today. What do you think? Did I miss any major myths? Are there other aspects of this alternate history scenario you'd like me to explore? Let me know in the comments, and as always, don't forget to like and subscribe for more historical myth busting.